أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So what I'm going to do is go through the first section of this ayah, inshallah. And I'll be going through aspects in grammar as well as rhetoric, inshallah. So this ayah follows the previous one, which talks about Dhul Qarnayn going on his journey. And there it says, hatta, until. So hatta is used for an end point. So he went on his journey until he reached this particular point. An example of hatta being used, it says, Sumtu Ramadana hatta Yawm al-Fitr. I fasted Ramadan up until the day of Eid al-Fitr. So hatta denotes an end point. Now in this case, it's not talking about the end of his journey. He had more traveling to do, but it talks about reaching a point when something significant happened. So he traveled until, so hatta idha. Idha, actually, plays a dual role here. It's an adverb of time, it's a dharf, zaman. It's also a noun of condition. The fact that it's a noun of condition, there would be what we call fi'lu shart and jawabu shart. So in other words, what's happening here, it's saying idha, when, balagha, when he reached Maghrib al-Shams, he found it. In other words, for this to happen, it would rely upon this. So when he reached it, the setting of the sun, he found it, the sun setting in a spring of dark mud. So this actually is a conditional sentence. Another example of this in the Quran, in the same surah, we have, this is talking about Musa alayhi salam and Al-Khidr alayhi salam, where it says فَانْطَلَقَا. So they set out حَتَّى إِذَا. Same wording here. حَتَّى إِذَا رَكِبَا. Until when they embarked في السفينة, on the ship. خَرَقَهَا. So when they boarded, Al-Khidr alayhi salam tore it open. So فعل الشرط جواب الشرط. He would not have been able to tear it open if he had not boarded the ship. So this is a conditional sentence also, similar to in the ayah. So in other words, what's happening here is that this has been narrated from the perspective of Dhul Qarnayn, because it's a conditional sentence. When he reached Maghrib al-Shams, he found it. And it was actually from the perspective of Dhul Qarnayn, because had Dhul Qarnayn not reached this point, he would not have seen it. Okay? Now, I've spoken about the word wajada in another video, and to add to what I said before, it's actually used for perceiving something with one of the five senses. That's actually one of the meanings of it. So whether it's sight, smell, touch, hearing, you can use wajada for that. And it's also used for strong emotional states. So hatta idha balagha, to reach. I've got a video on this as well, balagha, and there was effort involved there until he reached this point. What did he reach? Maghrib al-Shams, the setting of the sun, which indicates the point where he was standing as well as the time when the setting of the sun took place. And this was from his perspective, because Maghrib is relative. My Maghrib here in Sydney is different from, for example, your Maghrib in, say, Riyadh or in San Francisco. Okay? And so when he reached Maghrib al-Shams, he found it, meaning the sun. This is referring to the sun. تَغْرُبُ فِي عَيْن, setting in a spring. حَمِئَةٍ, a dark spring or a muddy spring. Now, this sentence here, تَغْرُبُ فِي عَيْنٍ حَمِئَةٍ, this sentence actually is known as a jumla haliyah. When we talk about the jumla haliyah, we're talking about a temporary state. So for example, here we have two sentences. وَجَدْتُ الشَّمْسَ طَالِعًا, I saw the sun come out. So طَالِعًا is the temporary state of the sun. And we also have وَجَدْتُ الشَّمْسَ تَطْلَعُ مِنْ وَرَاءِ الْجَبَلِ, which is I saw or I perceived the sun coming out from behind the mountain. It doesn't mean that the Shams comes out from behind a mountain, because as I said, the verb wajada or here وجدت, it refers to perceiving something with one of the five senses. You can't smell the sun, you can't hear the sun, but you see the sun. So in other words, تغرب في عين حامئة is actually the state of the sun as he perceived the sun. And he saw it, or perceived it, the sun, after بلغ مغرب الشمس, after he reached the setting of the sun. So what we can say is, from all this, is that this is obviously not describing a natural phenomenon that we can all see. It's talking from the perspective of Dhul Qarnayn. That's very obvious. Secondly, now I'm going to touch a bit on rhetoric, inshallah. For example, if we want to talk about a natural phenomenon of the sun as a universal law, for example, in the ayah, الشمس والقمر بحسبان, the sun and the moon move by precise calculation. And this is related to their nature, that they move with absolute precision. Notice here, Shams is the subject. Now where's the Shams mentioned here? Here we have Maghrib al-Shams, which is the setting of the sun. And we have here this Damir, this pronoun, which is the object. You wouldn't use a conditional sentence from the perspective of Dhul Qarnayn to describe a natural phenomenon. That's the first point I want to mention. Secondly, when manifestation of Allah's power in the universe is mentioned, then this is accompanied by one or more of the following. And they are that Allah is mentioned in the context, specification, and there needs to be the plural of majesty. Now, based on the context, Allah is not mentioned in this ayah, in the context of the sun setting. We do have here Allah mentioned, قُلْنَا, that's the plural of majesty, Ya Dhul Qarnayn, but this is used because of revelation to Dhul Qarnayn. When revelation is mentioned, you have the plural of majesty being used. But it wasn't used in the context of what Dhul Qarnayn saw. And there's no specification, and there's no plural of majesty. And Allah is not mentioned in this section. Now, with examples of this, we have the ayah that I showed you just a minute ago. الشمس والقمر بحسبان. If you look at the context of that, it starts off with الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان, and so on. And then you get to الشمس والقمر بحسبان. This surah mentions the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The whole surah. It was mentioned in the context of Allah's blessings. And Allah was mentioned, Ar-Rahman. Example of specification. We have the ayah, وَهُوَ الَّذِي, and it is He who created. So that's a typical way that you mention the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ. I have listened on specification if you want more information about that. And you can see clearly that the surah is speaking about the sun, the moon, the day and night. And this is not from the perspective of anyone. This is a general verse regarding these creations. And the final example is regarding the plural of majesty. So here twice it's been mentioned. فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا وَجَعَلْنَا. We separated them, we, and وَجَعَلْنَا. And we made from water every living thing. So this is talking about creation, how the world began, and here the plural of majesty is being used. Over here, nothing of that sort. We don't even have, for example, الشمس تغرب في عين حامئة. It's وجدها. He perceived it with his eyes. Next we're going to be talking about sentence structure. So, for example, the ayah says ووجدها تغرب في عين حامئة. This في عين حامئة is a prepositional phrase, a jar majroor. And this is associated to this verb here, تغرب. Where is the setting? في عين حامئة. That's where it's setting. And the verb تغرب, what does it mean? It doesn't mean to enter into. It means to disappear. Now, if, for example, this jar majroor was brought in front, we can bring it in front and make this jar majroor, or preposition phrase, be associated to wajada. This would actually change the meaning. This would actually mean he saw it, meaning the sun, in a muddy spring while it was setting. So this structure actually would make the meaning closer to what the non-Muslims would like it to say. But it doesn't say it this way. This is not Quran. So I hope that's clear now. Alhamdulillah. Okay, so that completes lesson. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
فاتبع سببا حتى إذا بلغ مغرب الشمس وجدها تغرب في عين حمئة ووجد عندها قوما.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Now, as I've shown previously, the early commentators concentrated on speaking about the spring and not the sun setting in the spring. Actually, they don't mention this. So you can examine those tafsirs and find out for yourself. Now, what I want to speak about in this lesson is regarding the nature of the spring, which is what actually the commentators in the past spoke about. They mentioned two different qualities of this spring, which were that it was black or dark, and the other one, hot. Both of those descriptions for the spring have to do with the different recitations that have reached us from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam in an unbroken chain. And they are Aynin Hamiyatin and Aynin Hami'atin. So the second one is actually the one used in the qira'ah of Hafs and Asim, which is the most famous one today. So Aynin Hami'atin. We also have Aynin Hamiyah. Allah intended both of these meanings in the ayah. So Aynin Hamiyah means a hot spring, like this one here. And we have Aynin Hami'atin, which means a black spring or a muddy spring. Now I'm going to be presenting from a famous tafsir which was written last century, At-Tahrir wa Tanwir by Shaykh Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur, rahimahullah. Now what he's done is he's taken opinions from scholars of the past and he's added his own commentary to the ayat. And what he says is the following. It's regarding the Ayn that Dhul Qarnayn saw. He says, وَيَظْهَرُ أَنَّ هَذِهِ الْعَيْنِ مِنْ عُيُونَ النَّفْطِ. And it's apparent, so it's quite apparent to him that this spring is from the springs of a naft. A naft actually is petroleum, or in America they call it oil. The spring, al-waqi'atu ala sahili bahri al-Khazr. Another name for it is Qazwin, which is the Caspian Sea. So he's saying that it's apparent that it's from the springs of petroleum, the one that is present on the shores of the Caspian Sea. Haythu Madinatu Baku. In the vicinity of the city of Baku. In English it's Baku, B-A-K-U. And it says here, وَفِيهَا مَنَابِعَ النَّفْطِ الْآن. In it now are oil wells. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ مَعْرُوفًا يَوْمَئِذٍ. And this was not known in the time of Dhul Qarnayn. So what he's saying actually is that this is actually a prophecy. What he saw was a well that had petroleum mixed in it. And this was giving the blackness of the Ayn. What happens actually naturally, there's actually a phenomenon known as a petroleum seep. And this explains how petroleum can come to the surface naturally. And it says here, petroleum seeps are quite common in many areas of the world. And that's obviously the ones that are rich in oil. Now, this is actually the area that he was speaking about, Baku. And that's the Caspian Sea there. And this is actually an area with a large oil industry. Now, let's actually look at a satellite view of this. And that's the area here that Ibn Ashur was speaking about. Another point is there's actually volcanic activity in this area. And there are a lot of hot springs as well. What he might have seen was a hot spring that had a petroleum seep. And that matches perfectly with the ayah, with both of the recitations, Hamia and Hamia. Now a few questions. Now if you want to mention this fact in the Quran, which surah would be the surah that you would mention it in? The one that would be most relevant. This story is mentioned in the surah of the Quran which the Prophet ﷺ asked us to recite each week on Friday. So there's relevance to us. And also, it is a protection from the trials of the Dajjal at the end of time. So, the most relevant surah where petroleum would be mentioned is Surah Al-Kahf. And that's where it's mentioned. Second question. If petroleum is mentioned, it's mentioned in a way that somebody saw it. Which personality in the Quran, prophets, righteous people, whoever it is, which one would have been the best person to observe it and for it to be relevant to him? In my opinion, it's Dhul Qarnayn. And the reason why I say this is because Dhul Qarnayn was a world leader and the superpower of his time. Petroleum and world power are connected as we see today. There are wars going on today because of petroleum. And so the fact that Dhul Qarnayn saw this spring is quite remarkable. He saw something which was going to become the product or the thing that is most sought after in order to become a superpower. That's very interesting. And some other points about this. The ayah talks about him discovering the spring as the sun set. Now it's interesting because when we talk about time, the time that mankind has been on this earth, we can describe it as a day. Now, sunset actually is a metaphor for the end of time. And it's very interesting that he actually saw this spring at that point. And at the end of the day, we say Allahu Alam, but it is quite remarkable, all those connections. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.